Good morning. It's Friday morning. It was a great week. We celebrated May Day, and now we have with us Joti, Brar. We've got a lot to talk about. Let's talk. Hello, Garland, Nixon here with Joti, Brar. It's Friday morning, a great week, lots going on. Lots of frightening things in the world, but there are always frightening things in the world. We're going to be positive. And one of the things I'll say, the last time I talked to Joti, Brar, she said something that was very inspiring because, you know, we all get freaked out about the fear of change and the collapse of the system, etc. And one of the things that Joti brought up that I thought was very important, because I always like to look for positive things, was that, and if I could get you to comment on it, I'll throw it out at you, Joti. And that was this. We've got a terrible system that oppresses the working class, pretty much oppresses everybody but a tiny minority. And we have to be careful that as the system crashes, that we don't, shall we say, weep and gnash our teeth, because it can cause us to want to work to somehow save or preserve a system that's beating us down. We should, Malcolm X did a famous talk where he talked about the slaves, and he talked about the field slaves, that would be us, all, of how badly they were treated. And he said, if the master's house caught on fire, they prayed for wind, right? And, whereas he's talked about the house slaves, and it was a great metaphor, because that would be the bribed class, the class that are benefiting from the system still somewhat, right? They would go, oh no, master, our house is on fire. They would go try to preserve it because they were living still not great, but better than us. But that the people were suffering would say, let the system burn, right? And I think that's the metaphor that works very well. Your thoughts on that, Joti?
I think that's a really good metaphor for the distinction between the working class in the imperialist countries and the working masses in the oppressed countries. In the oppressed countries, the brutal nature of the system is right in their face. They don't have the cushioning that protects them to some degree and stops them from falling into total starvation and abject misery in the way that they used to do before World War II. If you read Marx's Capital, it's full of descriptions of Victorian England and, even before that, during the development of British industry, which are horrific in the detail they give of the lives of the working poor of Britain in all the different industries. And the numbers of people who were just starved to death when they couldn't find employment. So when they had employment, their lives were horrific. When they didn't have employment, they died, right? Well, we have been brought up since World War II because we had this temporary situation of a really substantial cushioning for the whole working class, not just a small section, which always had cushioning in the imperialist countries. The labor aristocracy, Lenin called them, but the entire working class after 1945 was given cushioning and made to feel that it didn't have to have a socialist revolution to have a good life, to have decent conditions of existence. It could have healthcare, could have a secure job, it could have a pension, could have a secure home, could have, some holidays, could have culture, could have all the things that before then workers understood only socialism would give them. In the West, that deal was made. But it was made, we've talked about this, it was made off the backs of the poor elsewhere, right? It was made by tightening the screws on the rest of the empire, on the rest of the world's workers. And so this deal is coming apart right now. But yes, this distinction between the house slave and the field slave, I think, is a very apt one. And our conditioning, our cushioning has taught us in the West to feel that we have a stake in the system. So where previously, before World War II, there was a phenomenon whereby an upper layer of the working class in the advanced capitalist countries, the imperialist countries, felt that they identified their privilege with the system. and wanted to maintain the system, and they acted as Lenin described it, as labor lieutenants in the working class. They acted on behalf of the system to control the anger and the activity of the working classes and stop it getting out of hand, stop it becoming revolutionary, keep it respectable. But since 1945, we had this situation where most of the population in the West, almost all of the population, received a level of bribe that made them identify themselves with the system and made them believe that the system was reformable and that somehow we were just step by step progressing into a progressive and lovely future. Now, of course, we're now living in a world where that narrative's been falling apart. You know, the crisis came back, the welfare state settlements being unpicked, and the fall of the Soviet Union and the Eastern European socialist countries massively accelerated that process. It had already started, in fact, late 70s and through the 80s. It was already happening, but massively accelerated since the fall of the Soviet Union, because the competition of that example was gone, and the ideological triumphalism of the ruling class was really dominant. You know, socialism was in massive kind of panicked retreat. And as far as most people, certainly in the West, were concerned, socialism had been proved to be a failure, right? They only knew the version of socialism they were taught in their school history books. And then they saw the fall of the Soviet Union and said, oh, well, the people tried that, it doesn't work, right? And the bourgeoisie was kind of triumphal, said, look, this is capitalism, is the end of history. This is it, people. This is the best you can get. This is the ultimate expression of human nature. So to come back to what you were talking about, this idea that, you know, we are living in unstable times now. We're actually back to a situation that preceded World War I and preceded World War II, which is a massive instability of the system brought about by the system working as it should. Right? These situations are not aberrations. Right. This is the natural development of capitalist exploitation and concentration of wealth that happens as capitalism exists and does what it does. Right? Wealth is concentrated. What does that mean? It means a few people are super, super, super rich, ever richer, sitting on piles of wealth that they don't know what to do with. The vast masses of humanity, including in the imperialist countries, are systematically, steadily impoverished. That's what that means. The concentration of wealth means the impoverishment of the masses. And that is how capitalism works. And there isn't a way around that inside the system of capitalism. So when we look and see this instability and it scares us, and we sort of wish to get back to where we used to be, we come back again to something you and I have talked about before, which is the desire to go back to 1945 or whichever year you think everything was great or getting better or when things were decent, is a fundamental misunderstanding of how history works, of what brought about those conditions that seemed like, well, they were great steps forwards for lots of working people, but where did that time lead to? It led to here. So the best you can get if you manage a back to 1945 scenario is that in a few decades, you're back again in this unstable period of massive crisis, of looming fascism, of drive into insane war, of the destruction of society's wealth and society's people as an inevitable outcome of the workings of the capitalist system.
You know, I think that's a very, very, it makes a lot of things very clear to me, and I'll tell you why. The ruling elite know this very well, right? I think of when I was a kid growing up, and I think of, like, let's say the 80s, the 70s, stuff like that, right? And when I think about it, you know, my dad was a longshoreman, and there was like factories. My dad had a friend who worked at it was called SK Sausage. They made breakfast sausage, and he worked on the line stuffing sausages, right? This guy had a home. His wife didn't work. his kids went to college, and he retired, just like my dad, with a retirement and a pension. The guy worked at a freaking sausage, stuffing sausages, and he had a decent middle-class life, right? And got my dad's friend and his friends. Every couple of years, they bought the people in that age, they like pickup trucks was big then. They'd have a pickup truck, right? And I grew up thinking that's the way life, that's the expectations. You can have a middle class life if you choose. You can work. They didn't have great educations, and the appearance in, say, the 70s, and 80s was that a person can get out of school, there's a job waiting for you in a factory or wherever, and you get a job and you can buy things and you can buy a home and all of that, right? What we get when a Joe Biden or Donald Trump or somebody runs now, think about this: make America great again. I'm going to bring back the good jobs and good pay. We understand that there was a time period when you weren't restive like you are now because things were okay. And now, since you can't get that anymore, how long can we string you out by promising you that? How long can we string out this system by before the only people that had credit cards were like traveling salesmen? Salespeople had credit cards. Now everybody's got to have a credit card. Before, a wife could stay at home or work if she chooses. Now the wife has to work. Now the kids have to work. Now everybody has to work in order to be. Now they have to be on credit. Now we're trying to pretend to you that that's still there, that's available, or that's here now on credit, or maybe you can, what I mean? They're still playing off that system or the hope that that system can return. So they clearly know the game. Your thoughts?
They definitely know the game. I mean, people as individuals find it difficult to think in historical terms. If you in your lifetime have only known things a certain way or have grown up with a certain set of assumptions, it's very difficult for you to put those assumptions in a wider context and understand the special circumstances that created those assumptions. It just seems to you, it's like our kids grow up in a world with screens, right? They were born looking at parents who tap, tap, tap on screens, right? And as soon as they were old enough, they started joining in. And to them, tapping on screens is as natural as breathing. To us, we look at our kids and go, it's so weird how good they are with these screens, right? But to them, the world always had screens in it. And when you say to your kids, when I was little, we didn't have screens, they look at you like you're a monster with three heads. What on earth are you talking about? How can they? And they can't really imagine it, because it's been in their consciousness since before they were consciously, thinking about anything. It's just programmed in there that this is, you're born with 2 arms, 2 legs, and a screen to tap, right? Now, this can make us very manipulable by our rulers when it comes to this question of our rights, because we had this weird, anomalous period after World War II. The real reason we had it was because of the imminent threat of socialist revolution all the way across Europe. That was the reason that we had the welfare states. Even in the USA, they implemented theirs slightly earlier in the 30s, the reform program, but it was very much under the same threat. The crisis of capitalism, the Great Depression, the Wall Street crash, all of those things, the terrible situation for workers and farmers in the USA during the 30s, contrasted with the incredible strides being made by workers and the planned economy in the Soviet Union. These two things were creating a revolutionary tide amongst the working class that was going to be unstoppable. Wow, what did I just do? That was going to be unstoppable. I can't hear you.
Sorry about that. I don't know what that is. I guess Langley's out there. The CIA's like, we got to let them know we're here. We are here. We are here. So we'll go with that.
Okay, I'll try and ignore that. I don't think I did.
Yeah, let's keep going. Yeah, they're trying to distract us, but it won't work.
I don't think I did anything. That's all. I was like, did I press something? Is there a setting? Okay, it's the kind of thing my kids do to my applications, and then I can't work out how to undo it. Anyway, what was I on about? Yes, so there was a revolutionary tide amongst the working people, and fundamentally, it was the fear of total overthrow of their system that forced the ruling classes to make these retreats and give these concessions to the majority of workers in the West. It was fueled for us in Europe. It was also fueled by the need for reconstruction after World War II. There was a great demand for labor power, lots and lots and lots of jobs for a considerable period of time. In fact, they had so much need for labor power, they had to bring in immigrants from the colonized countries to keep the cost of wages down and make sure we had a good flow of available labor to do all the jobs that needed doing. And of course, you know, like I said earlier, you know, it was paid for fundamentally by looting the empire more systematically, more kind of draconianly, tightening the screws. And this is something that we have to really also understand. You know, we can be very isolationist in our view and not understand the impact it has on the whole of the world, you know, and to say, you know, we talked last time, I think, about the kind of the social democratic compact, which was we as workers will take this bribe and in return, we won't look at what it means for the rest of the world. We won't let ourselves understand that our privilege is now based in the deepened exploitation, the misery, the impoverishment, the suppression of the liberation desires of people in the rest of the globe. And something I think that's really important for us to realize when we're looking at, for example, if you read the factory inspectors' reports, and you know, which Karl Marx's Capital is full of quotes from these types of reports, the reports into the employment of women and children, reports into the conditions in this industry or that industry, and they're so horrific. And we have been brought up to think of those as something from the distant past, just like my kids think of a world without internet as something prehistoric. We think of a world where industrial workers suffer starvation and horrific diseases and die at the age of 30 as something long ago. What we actually have to understand is those conditions continue to be the conditions of industrial workers. Things are still made by industry, by the way. Those continue to be the conditions of huge numbers of industrial workers around the world. One of the reasons that imperialism gets into exporting capital, and exporting capital means exporting production. Rather than doing your production on shore and then selling it to the world, you find you make more profits by exporting your capital and setting up production elsewhere. Why is that more profitable? Because the land is cheaper, the raw materials are cheaper, the workers are cheaper. Why are the workers cheaper? Because you've kept them in a situation where their unions are criminalized, where they're so desperate for work because if they don't have it, they'll starve, that they'll work in the most horrific conditions, where there are no laws saying you can't employ 4-year-old kids making lace, or you know, all the things that became rather an irritant to the industrialists in the West as capitalism developed and policies started to come in about actually the working day has to be limited and the age of people working has to be limited, and all these types of things gradually were achieved by workers. You know, they found that when you export capital, you don't have any of those limitations, and also you don't have governments which are strong enough to uphold environmental regulations. You can always buy your way around them, etc., etc., etc. So this is why capital is exported, and those conditions that we think of the industrial workers as being historical are still in existence, are still endured by huge numbers of people who make all the things that we then buy and are you know, happy to find that they're very cheap.
You know, I grabbed a piece of paper because I like to, you know, take some notes. So questions I want to ask or something like that. Here's something that popped into my mind: sweatshops. We use this term sweatshops, right? And so what we'll say is, name your company, Nike, Adidas, whoever, right? We'll say they make shoes in country X and they have sweatshops there and they treat the workers horribly, and that's unthinkable, and therefore don't buy Nikes, Adidas, whatever. Now that goes for a little bit, and then all of a sudden, you know, people say that and then they just go out and buy the shoes anyway because they intuitively understand that that's the way it works, that you can't buy, well, okay, don't buy these sneakers because they're in sweatshops. Those are made in sweatshops. And sooner or later, if you're going to buy a pair of sneakers, they're all made in sweatshops. Here's my point. When people say, let's boycott this company because of sweatshops, it implies that the company is doing something evil. It ignores that what we're calling sweatshops over in Bangladesh, whatever, right, is that was what was here. And the system simply said, I can't do this. These there were sweatshops here, all the terrible things, you name it, locking people in, beating, all the things that we see, that was here. And it got a little hard to do here, and it got a little expensive, and maybe there was a few laws that stopped them. So they simply said, oh, darn, they got unions, they got laws that say we can't have dangerous conditions. They just lifted that system up and moved it to a poor country where they could manipulate the government, and that government couldn't pass worker safety rules, blah, blah, blah. So the concept that this company is doing it and we should boycott or be angry at the company misses that they just picked that system up. It wasn't not just that they moved the factory to this country because they could pay the people less per hour. It was part of it. But they could also control the government. They could overthrow the government. They could install puppets there, and they could get rid of worker safety laws, child safety, everything. And so it's the idea of sweatshops as a moral failing of the company, as opposed to this is the way that system works. They couldn't get away with it here, and they moved it the hell over there. Your thoughts?
100% Garland. I mean, really, you've said it all. What you've exposed there is the absolute farce of the label and the desire for fair trade, right? There is no such thing as fair trade. There is no such thing as fair capitalism. Capitalism and trade, by their very nature, in this economic system, are unequal and generate inequality. And as soon as you're in an unequal situation in a business environment, you are at the mercy of the person with more. And when you systematize that and spin it out historically, the level of inequality becomes such that all talk about equality under this system becomes absolutely farcical and obscene. When you have a world where 6 or 7 people have as much wealth between them as half the world's population, what the hell are you talking about equal before the law? Those 6 or 7 people are not equal before the law. They own the law. They stack the deck. They control the parameters of every interaction. You may have a legal right to be recognized as equal, but in practice, that right is utterly meaningless. The only really meaningful right we can have as workers under capitalism is the right to combine. And that right has to be unfettered, because as soon as you fetter it, it isn't a right at all, right? The point is, only by combining can we do anything towards leveling the playing field, which is the constant demand, again, of people who want to make capitalism fair, right? It's not fair. It's unequal. We need a level playing field. The only way the workers can create any type of equal interaction between themselves and the capitalists is to organize themselves en masse, and then, where necessary, withdraw their labor, which is the source of the capitalist wealth, right? And force them to negotiate. That is the only right with any meaning for a worker under a system of capitalism. So you're absolutely right when it comes to this demand for fair trade and for an end to sweatshop labor. It totally misses the point that sweatshops are not an anomaly. They are systematic. It is how capitalism works. Capitalism sweats labor. And if you haven't understood that, you haven't understood capitalism. The truth is that sweatshops can exist anywhere. We regularly in this country have like scandals or exposés. They come around like clockwork about the sweatshops that are happening right here in Britain, employing usually illegal immigrant, but not always, just downtrodden, very poor workers at rates of like maybe £1 an hour. I mean, utterly illegal, right? And yet every time they're exposed, guess what? Nothing happens. The companies that are using them say, oh dear gosh, we didn't realize, because they've got a subcontracting type of setup so they can pretend that it's nothing to do with them, but they all know. And basically it's in the fashion industry, right? And they have these sweatshop conditions. Very often they'll be in a situation where their passport is taken by their manager. They're forced into certain situation of this £1 an hour type of pay in very, cramped, difficult conditions. The last time we had a big scandal about this was when it was realized that these conditions, and of course they carried on working through the pandemic, it realized that these conditions in sweatshops in Leicester in the garment industry had created a hub of COVID spreading. And so then it was a scandal again. And now, guess what? No one's talking about it. But do you think they've gone away? Do you think Leicester is not right now, full of sweatshops? I guarantee you, Garland, that it is. And every time the Financial Times or Parliament, you ask questions about it, a few people tut and everyone goes, yes, this is a very difficult problem. And then they brush it under the carpet and carry on.
Yes. Let me, the other thing that I think is critical is the understanding that the ruling elite are horrified of revolution, and they understand that they are creating the environment wherein people will be desperate and push back. An interesting article, and I'm going to give you a little bit from it. Caitlin Johnstone wrote a great article. Empire managers explain why this new protest movement scares them. They understand that if they lose control of the narrative, they won't be able to deploy their armies, right? This is great. I'll give you a little bit of it. Basically, Secretary Blinken and this guy who runs a company called Palantir, which is just a tech company that's run, owned, and paid for by the CIA. It's not a company at all. It's a government entity, right? So they're at one of these discussion places at of course, the Ash Carter Exchange on Innovation and National Security. The military, what is it? The think tank industrial military complex, right? So they're talking about these college protests. And this guy, now they talk about the guy, he's a billionaire, sits on the steering committee of the Bilderberg Group, regularly features at the World Economic Forum, right? Plutocrat, empire management guy. Here's what he says about the protests. We kind of just think these things are happening across college campuses, especially, are like a sideshow. No, they are the show, Karp said, because if we lose the intellectual debate, you will not be able to deploy any army in the West ever, right? So this guy, while people are looking at the protests saying, why are they beating up the students? They're innocent students. They have a right. They've got First Amendment rights, which I argue we have no rights. From the perspective of the ruling elite, they grant us privileges from their perspective, which they have a right, and might I add a duty, to revoke anytime it becomes inconvenient for them. So we're like, hey, we've got rights. They're like, yeah, rights. Do you believe that one? But the bottom line is, we are like, we don't understand it. They see this thing as revolution. And they're like, man, if these kids win this, we can't deploy armies. And I think part of it is because those are the cannon fodder that they want to send, draft into the army. Anyway, your thoughts on this guy saying, if we lose the intellectual debate, you will not be able to deploy any army in the West ever. Sounds like they see this as very drastic.
They definitely do. I find that phrasing fascinating, really, Garland, because they lost the intellectual debate a really long time ago.
Right.
They don't have arguments anymore. And one of the reasons they don't have arguments is because all the arguments they did have, which were all false, they were all based on the idea that capitalism's the best system. And in order to back that up, they rested on the conditions we talked about, the fact that the majority of workers in the West had a cushioned existence that stopped them from realizing the nature of the system and made them believe that capitalism serves the interests of society, if for want of a better word, of the majority of people, right? People could accept spurious arguments in favor of continued rule by monopoly capital because it seemed to deliver for them. The problem is those spurious arguments become very obviously spurious when capital is not delivering for the people in its own heartlands. And so they lost that argument. They have lost the argument. They don't have arguments. You've made the point. The only argument they really have is force. It's just suppression. It's just silence everybody, stop them talking, make them scared to talk, push down on them so hard that they think again about imagining that they've got rights and trying to speak up, terrorize them by saying, you won't have a degree, you won't be able to get a career, all that debt you've taken on is going to be for nothing. Don't be so stupid as to risk your possibility of any kind of a future by putting your neck on the line for these supposed rights, and either of yourself or of anybody around the globe. But in terms of losing the argument's lost. And I think what's interesting about what you said and what you said from Caitlin Johnston's article is, the truth is, yes, the ruling class recognizes a revolutionary situation developing, and yes, they run around warning each other. 10 years ago or more, I remember reading a lovely article by a defender of the system, and he was a rich guy. I can't remember his name, but he was at least a multimillionaire. And he said, the pitchforks are coming. So he's warning members of his own class, watch out, you're pushing too hard, and the workers are becoming restive, and it's only going to get more so. If you carry on the same way, there'll be revolutions. They will come for you with the pitchforks. He, a rich guy, was warning the rest of his class. Now, we see a lot of this in the commentariat, and even from very rich people saying, we should do something about how we're behaving, because we're creating the system, we're creating the conditions for a revolutionary upsurge, and that's going to be bad for us. The problem is, they might be able to recognize this situation developing, but they are powerless in the face of it, because the revolutionary crisis is created by the workings of the capitalist system. It's not you can make a new policy and there won't be a revolutionary crisis. There is a revolutionary crisis because capitalism is doing what capitalism does, and it's creating a situation in which there will be a social explosion. And there's no way around that for the ruling class. They can try to navigate it. They can try to blame one another, and they do. They can try to come up with policies of being more or less repressive, more or less permissive, but fundamentally, they can't change the conditions that create the revolutionary upheaval itself.
You know, I was looking at a poll came out recently. Democrats, the party of Joe Biden, 83% are in favor of a permanent ceasefire. In the United States, or as a nation, the polls say 70% of people are. 56%. Yes, in Gaza. 56% of Democrats say this is definitely a genocide. The numbers are overwhelming. The ruling elite, and people are surprised. Oh my gosh, I can't believe this is crazy. Biden won't respond. The ruling elite, they won't respond to their constituents. You know, here are my thoughts. You thought you were fooled. You thought you bought into this idea of democracy. You thought they represented you. So now you're shocked that they don't. That when something comes along that threatens their hegemony, world hegemony over you, whatever, their access to oil in the Middle East and control, it doesn't matter if 183% of you say we're opposed to it. They're simply revealing the truth. You're shocked because the truth is hitting you in the face. Hey, I can't believe this. No, people like us have said this is not democracy. They don't represent you. And it's like a wake-up call to people who were being surprised. I mean, I look at those numbers and people are like, can you believe that? I'm like, yeah, you really thought that they somehow were going to represent you, and that if the numbers skewed towards most people wanting something, that the ruling elite would go? That's naive. Anyway, your thoughts on that?
That's very naive. And this is the lesson we've been being taught for quite some time. There was a pivotal moment in Britain where this lesson began the process of being learned, and that was the Iraq War protest movement. There was a huge movement amongst the masses against that war when Tony Blair was leading up to joining that invasion. And because the ruling class in Britain was actually split about whether or not it was a good idea to have the war. And part of our ruling class was very much aligned with the European approach, which was, yes, we want to get rid of Saddam Hussein, but not by an invasion. Remember the freedom fries and those awful Frenchies. So we had a split in our ruling class. And what that meant was there was a vigorous public debate in the mainstream media about whether or not the war was a good idea. And what that in turn meant was there was an opportunity for working people to hear both sides and choose a side, or at least understand there were two sides, and choose a side. And huge numbers of people were really opposed to the invasion of Iraq, to the point where we had 2 million people on the streets in London on 15th of February 2003. People in those days believed, really believed, like you were just saying, that our leaders are basically governed by the will of the people, the desire to serve, the desire to do the right thing, that they're basically sort of genuine, even if you don't like what they do or say, that they mean what they say and they do what they say. And, you know, all this type of, the mass of people have had these type of prejudices about the system, and they really believed if enough of us show that we're against this, it won't happen. But exactly the opposite happened, because the leadership of the anti-war movement was just content to keep the movement as a just a kind of Saturday protest thing, rather than trying to harness the power of all those people to physically disrupt the war machine and stop it, force the government by the power of numbers not to do its invasion. You know, force it by occupying the city, force it by occupying the RAF bases where the planes were taking off from, force it by occupying Whitehall where the civil servants are taking their decisions, right? Force the government not to do its war. They just kept it to, well done for turning up, amazing, amazing, see you next time. And because the government knew that that's what the anti-war leadership would do, they're a controlled opposition, they weren't a threat, those 2 million people affected nothing. The bombers were flying the other way, even as they were marching to Downing Street to demand that the war shouldn't happen, right? Tony Blair knew that they weren't a threat, and that was fine. But after that massive protest movement was totally ignored, we then had this slow process of information dribbling out. And again, we have to recognize that one of the reasons that we get access to this information is because of splits in the ruling class when their plans start to go wrong. So Iraq didn't go how it was supposed to go. It wasn't a quick, clean job where they just got the results done and came home triumphantly and said, yes, Saddam Hussein is gone and we rule, and now there's democracy in Iraq. They met a fierce resistance. They had to do a long, bloody occupation, which got more and more messy and more obviously was exposed as brutal. And all of the exposures we got about the nature of the occupation and the nature of the invasion came because of the Iraqi resistance. And we must never forget that, the power of resistance to change the narrative of the imperialists. So what happens? The job isn't done the way they wanted it to be. Then the ruling class starts falling out with itself. Then they start arguing in public about who said what and who did what and who thought what and who's right and who's wrong. And then we start to get leaks. And what were some of the leaks telling us? Very significantly, some of those leaks made it clear to us not only were the reasons we were given for the launch of the war lies. That's the first shock, right? Those reasons were lies. Number two, our rulers knew they were lies when they were saying them. So it wasn't that they were also misled by false information. They purposefully lied. Now, that information has been slowly seeping into the heads of the people. And it's been reinforced since that time by wave after wave of new crime, new lie, new exposure. And part of what helps these exposures to land with the people is we're living through a period of the decline in the living standards of the workers. So their objective conditions are making them susceptible to the information that what they had, the assumptions that they were fed as children and which form the basis of their worldview are wrong. All the things we were told about democracy and civilization and, you know, Western superiority were lies. And we are now open to that idea, particularly because our objective conditions have been deteriorating to the extent where we are ready to see through the lies of our ruling class in a way that we used to comfortably accept their lies because they suited us. Now they don't. Now we're cynical. And the more cynical we become, the more difficult it is for our rulers to lie to us, until we get to this point with Palestine, where the combination of our objective conditions and our anger about those conditions, the crisis is really bad. Inflation every month inflation is worse for workers everywhere in the world right now, unless you live in a country that doesn't get inflation like the DPRK, right? Everywhere in the world, inflation is getting worse every single month. And what does that mean for people? It means every month they're closer to not being able to put food on the table for their children. 1 in 3 British children go to school hungry and come home to a cold house. That is a horrific statistic that explains to you something about why the workers have become very cynical about the words and the intentions of the people who govern them. They don't trust them anymore. So the objective conditions create the groundwork for people to see through the lies. But besides that, of course, we also have this situation where, you know, with a conflict like the genocide in Gaza, the Palestine liberation struggle, this is something quite significant in its characteristics, quite unique in many ways, because it's a situation which has been ongoing for more than 75 years. And each time the conflict flares up, more people start to pay a bit more attention. More people start to look into it in a bit more detail and start to understand things that before they had glossed over or been content to let the BBC kind of explain to them that, oh, these people are always fighting and it's very complicated and don't worry about it, nothing to do with you. But there have been round after round after round of this conflict flaring up and being brought to people's attention and becoming clearer and clearer to people that there's a kind of fundamental injustice underpinning all of this. And maybe they should get to the bottom of it. And the particular ferocity of the assault on Gaza this time, the obvious genocidal intent of the Israeli regime this time, has made many more people than ever before decide, you know what, I'm going to have to find out more about what the flip is this Zionism. What is Israel really? Where is this really coming from? And of course, another thing that's fueling that is the realities of the way social media posts that are beyond the control of the monopoly capitalists are bringing information on an hourly basis directly to the masses in the West, those of the masses who are engaged. And, you know, let's admit that lots and lots of people are not engaged, but growing numbers of people are engaged. And for those who are engaged, they can get information in real time about what's happening, which gives the complete lie to every statement made by a ruler of Israel, of Britain, of anywhere in the EU, of the USA, in real time. So they can put next to each other the statements of Joe Biden and Rishi Sunak and Benjamin Netanyahu and the pictures they're seeing on the screen. And so this crisis of legitimacy for politicians and media has reached an absolute fever pitch. And that creates a very, very dangerous situation for the ruling class.
I agree. That explains Julian Assange, too. That explains why they had to go after him, because he's the most dangerous thing they can have is someone exposing the reality about who they are. There were elections recently in Great Britain. And interestingly enough, in those elections, we saw the Tories did terribly. The Labour didn't do better. People were looking for something else. There seems to be a severe political crisis going on There's one here, but it seems to me the outer edges of the empire, it's hitting there the hardest first. If you could explain the political crisis in England in a way that someone like me over here could understand it, because I see the things, but I don't understand the political crisis as well.
I think fundamentally, Garland, what we're looking at is a total crisis of legitimacy, as we were talking about earlier, and how that manifests itself first and foremost is the mass of the poor working class are not turning out to the elections. Turnout, I don't know what it was overall, but it was very low in these elections. They were mostly for local councils and regional authorities and things. It wasn't a parliamentary election. It was a round of kind of in England and Wales, I think, council elections and some mayoral elections. And they've started making all kinds of things into elections, like police commissioners and stuff. And those are elections that nobody pays any attention to, because no one knows who the candidates are or what they're standing for, or it's like meaningless to us. You know, they've started this election and so almost nobody votes in those. It's kind of a weird pretending to be democratic in a way where it's like the least democratic thing ever, introducing elections for all kinds of things in a way where nobody engages with it. Amazing. So you're right. The Tories took an absolute beating because everybody has had enough of Tory government, and every Tory leader we get is, as bad as the one before, and the policies remain the same. But Labour is not really seen under Keir Starmer by many people as a meaningful alternative. In fact, the people who really want Keir Starmer are the people in the City of London. They've been grooming him to be Prime Minister for quite a long time. They really want him. They wanted him when Corbyn was leader of the party. They've been grooming him and fitting him for that role. He's one of their very loyal servants. Everything about his career has shown you that he's their man, and he will do their bidding no matter what. So I think Finance Capital wants Keir Starmer and has wanted him for quite some time, and probably they're going to get him. But it's going to be on the basis that the mass of people feel like there's no point voting. They have learned, we were really brought up with the idea for decades after World War II that Labour's the party of working people. Labour always takes credit for the NHS, that's our National Health Service. They always take credit for council housing. They always take credit for the welfare state and say that was a Labour policy because they were in power when the welfare state was implemented. But the truth is that was a policy of the ruling class in the face of the pressure of the working class. And if Churchill had been the Prime Minister, it would have happened under him. Right? There was a consensus. It's called the Keynesian consensus after World War II, that to stave off socialism, you would spend money on social projects and there would be employment and all the things we've talked about. And in fact, in the 1950s, in their election manifestos, the Conservatives and Labour would vie with one another and argue over who had built the most council houses, right? Because those were the times. So the idea that Labour was, responsible for bringing us the welfare state because they're at heart, they're kind of socialists and they're people who look after the working class was always a trick. But it's a very useful trick to the ruling class. And for a long time, it worked. And so we were trained to believe that Labour's the party of the working class. And if you want better things, and if you're a socialist and blah, 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 and you believe in, jobs and houses and pensions and, workers' rights, you vote Labour. The problem is, since the late 70s and the collapse of the Keynesian consensus and the unpicking of the social compact and the gradual abolition of all of those gains, Labour Party has been in government as much as the Tory party or for long periods of time. They did not reverse. In fact, they accelerated all the policies that were instituted under Margaret Thatcher. In fact, Margaret Thatcher was once asked about her greatest legacy, and she said, Tony Blair. So, what working people in Britain have learned painfully over the last 4 decades is that Labour and Tory are both servants of monopoly capital Neither of them serves the interests of the working class. In what used to be industrial working class areas, which have been deindustrialized with the steady export of capital, and now have just become, poor, abandoned, places of high unemployment and high social deprivation. In these places, people out of class loyalty, because that's how they were trained and brought up, they continue to vote Labour election after election after election. And during that period of 40 years, let's not forget, during which there were 12 years at least of Labour government, Labour did nothing for them. Having Labour MPs, having Labour councillors, whole councils in their areas run by the Labour Party for decades, having MPs who were always Labour, did not save them a library book, never mind a job, never mind a factory, never mind an industry. It got them nothing at all. So they learned there's no point. These politicians, and they should really say bourgeois politicians, they're all the same. They serve the same people and it ain't us. So what you're really looking at in Britain is the result of this growing understanding that the politicians all work for finance capital, the man, right? And not for the people. They're not responsive to the needs. They're not representative of the interests of ordinary working class people. And as a result, the majority of poor working class people don't vote. Let's not forget that the real numbers, the real proportion of people who vote is not properly documented, because when we look at turnout numbers, that's a percentage of the people who were on the electoral register. But the more that people become disaffected with the electoral system, the less they bother registering. So how many people are not even on the electoral register who are above the age of 18 and ought to be eligible to vote? Growing numbers. So you're looking at falling percentage of turnout on a declining electoral register. And I think that's the number one most important thing to understand. Before you start analysing who got how many votes, understand that the biggest single thing you're seeing is a turning away from the bourgeois electoral system. People don't trust it. They don't trust politicians. They don't believe that voting is going to change anything. And the reason they don't believe that is not because they're apathetic or stupid. It's because they've got 40 years of experience of seeing how their votes didn't change anything. And I think once you then start looking at the voting itself, you're then looking at a section of the population that's still hoping that voting will change something. And actually that section is smaller than the section that believes it won't. So now let's look at that proportion of people who are hoping that voting will change something. And what you see is significant. That, as you said, the Tories took a beating, but Labour did not do brilliantly. Labour did worse than it did under Jeremy Corbyn. Labour's not like riding to an amazing victory. And, I remember the 1997 election that brought Tony Blair to power. And I was one of the few people I knew who didn't vote Labour then. I was one of the people who was already saying, these people are bastards. They're not going to do any of the things you hope. But I was surrounded by this wave of euphoria. All the people I knew were like, oh, thank God we're going to get rid of the Tories. It's going to be amazing. Tony Blair's great, and people really believed that. There was a wave of enthusiasm through the country. There is no wave of enthusiasm for Labour right now. The last time Labour had a wave of enthusiasm was under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. Again, made up of the section of people already dwindling, remember, who still believe that voting will change something. Well, because of the Corbyn project, those numbers have declined. Those numbers of people who think voting is going to change something drastically reduced because of the numbers who jumped in thinking, yay, Corbyn, yay, return of socialism, yay, someone responsive to the needs of the masses. And they saw what happened to him. They saw that he couldn't stand up to the pressure from the establishment, number one. He was not a worthy leader of their hopes and aspirations. Number two, the establishment, despite how weak he was, could not tolerate him, and his own party destroyed his leadership and his chances of election. Without the sabotage of his own party machine, he would have been Prime Minister in 2017. Stop and think about that. Labour blew up its own chances of being the government in 2017 in order to make sure that Jeremy Corbyn wasn't Prime Minister. That's the Labour Party did that to itself. right? So as a machine for the interests of the, as a vehicle for the interests of the working people, it's quite clearly been exposed to anybody who wants to take a proper look at it. So, of course, the numbers of people who think voting changes things has shrunk again. What's I think also interesting is looking at the people who were voting, even the Lib Dems, who very often are the party that people shift to when they want to show they're pissed off with Labour and the Tories, they didn't make big gains. So the gains were all on the side of very small parties or independent entirely candidates, or they just left, they just left everybody with, fewer votes, fewer seats. Okay, so Labour made a big advance in numbers of seats, but in numbers of votes they got less. So it's all that the sort of balance of how it all works out shifts. But the big headline is that there was no big winner from the Conservatives' defeat. Probably the kind of biggest news was that there were 4 councillors elected for George Galloway's Workers' Party. But 4 councillors out of however many, thousands and thousands there are in the country. It's small potatoes, but it is significant when you consider how hard it is to break through in British politics. That 4 of them were elected in across Britain.
There's one last thing. I got to go in a few minutes. We got about 5 minutes. I'd like to throw this at you. I have friends the same way that have like given up, like, I'm not voting. These parties aren't going to do anything for you. So another person I know who still has hope, right, said, no, that's exactly what the ruling elite want. They want you to stop voting so that the other side will win, blah, blah, blah. And I said, I don't believe that. I think the ruling elite understands the dynamic that as more and more people fall off, if they say, okay, if it gets to the point where there are 2 voters left, that the other 98% are, out of 100 voters, there's only 2 voters left, 2% of the people vote. They understand that the other 98% are just not going to sit around and accept that rather than saying that the ruling elite are perfectly thrilled for nobody to vote, then they have whatever they want. They can have family and friends day and only their family and friends vote. And whoever gets elected is whoever has the most family and friends, right? But I think they understand that there's a different dynamic at play. And that if people stop voting, that's a sign of something to come, shall we say. We got about 5 minutes. Your thoughts on that?
Definitely, Garland. I think there's kind of truth in both positions. I'm going to be annoying there, because there is a question, as you put it, of the legitimacy of the system. If too many people stop paying attention to the elections, it becomes obvious that there's a deep-rooted problem, and you can't just dismiss it. So they want to keep, I'm sure, enough of the people engaged in voting, enough of the people believing in the system, that they can then brand the people who have become disaffected and alienated from the system as apathetic, as uneducated, as idiots. And there's always a concerted campaign to set these 2 sections of the working class against one another, isn't there? It's the privileged versus the less privileged, always being incited against one another. And this is one of the ways they're incited. Look at those idiots and the fact that they won't engage in the democratic process. They're just uneducated and stupid oafs, right? And it's, you feel superior because you do your civic duty and you understand and you engage with the process and you understand how democracy works and that our forefathers fought for the right to vote and blah, blah, all this stuff. Our grandmothers sacrificed themselves so that we could go and put our X on the ballot paper. How dare you not do that, you idiot, right? But so we're encouraged to blame one another for how we feel about the democratic system. But you're right, the ruling class needs, in one way, your friend is right. There is an element to which the most disenfranchised not voting is totally convenient to the ruling class. Because if the mass of the poor aren't involved in the elections, then nobody even has to pretend to be catering to their demands in their election manifestos. And all of that stuff's a bit inconvenient. And especially right now in a time of crisis when the truth is, we're going to do nothing for you. It's not an accident that in all the election manifestos, the one nod they make to the concerns of the working class is a concern that they manufactured and fabricated, which is the concern that immigration is causing working people's problems. And they all compete to vie with one another about who's going to be the harshest on immigration, precisely because it fits with their agenda of encouraging us to blame other workers for the problems that the capitalist system has created. But when it comes to anything else that might help working people, like building houses, creating jobs, putting a cap on the price of energy, guaranteeing that everybody has the right to a home, guaranteeing that nobody lives below the poverty line, guaranteeing that every child will be literate, they're not going to fix those problems, right? They're not going to make those promises. They're not even going to start those conversations. So, just directing all of our frustration into immigration and telling us, oh, well, if only those immigrants weren't here, everything would be back to 1945, and don't you wish they'd all go away and our lives would get better again? It's a massive exercise in misdirection, and it's what the ruling class is past masters at. It's divide and rule.
Wow. I'm 100% with you. I've been trying to figure this immigration thing out, and that gave me a good starting point to work from. Because I knew that, here's what I always know. When you ask the ruling elite what the problem is, they'll always point to someone that's poorer than you. Never look up. What's the problem? The people down there that really can't speak the language and they're picking grapes for $2 a day and they're being mistreated and abused. The people that are only here because we destabilized their country and they lost everything and now they're coming across here. They're basically, I'll put it like this. We stole their resources and brought them here. And they're following those resources that were stolen from them back to where they are now, right? They can't say that. So you have to blame someone. Anytime someone is blaming someone that has less than you, that ain't the problem. At any rate, last but not least, Joti, give people the information as to where they can find you, where they can find your stuff online, on YouTube, all of that.
Thank you. So you can follow me on Telegram at Joti Brar. That is my name. Also, my party is on Telegram, The Communists with an S. Our website is there, thecommunist.org. And we are on YouTube as Proletarian TV. What else should I tell you? I can't think of anything right now. That seems all right.
That's great. Proletarian TV on YouTube, and follow Joti on Telegram and all that kind of stuff, X, etc. Thank you very much. Look forward to talking to you again soon. Everyone, don't forget, share this on all your social media platforms. Smash the old like button. I don't know if that probably doesn't do a lot of good on the algorithm. I'm sure the algorithm that's written for people like Joti and I are, the like button is not going to be something that really helps, but do it anyway. At least you'll feel good about yourselves, right? All right. Thanks a lot, everybody. Don't forget, share this on all your social media platforms. Peace. We're out.